and the old house stood there looking vacantly toward the sea on its threatened knoll, wondering what it was and what it was yet to be. The 1853 Johnston house near Half Moon Bay has always represented something special to those involved with San Mateo County history. Although not a mansion in the sense of structures built a decade later, its simplicity does more than 100 turrets or towers in passing on the feeling of early American California. Outwardly, the building is a salt box, typical in the East but rare in California. Its hand-hewn timbers and pegs of native redwood are superb examples of craftsmanship. Set in a wild, romantic vista of sloping fields and ocean shore, but more than this, the house is a blend of disparate cultures brought together by the Western migrations. James P. Johnston's life began far from the Pacific on the shores of Melrose, Scotland, on October 7, 1813. He was the eldest of 9 children. In 1818, the call of a better life drove the family to board the ship, the Prompt, and head for America, eventually settling in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1826, the Johnston family faced the death of James' father, William, prompting James' mother and her 8 children to move by flatboat down the Ohio River to Gallipolis, Ohio. They began raising dairy cattle on the open plains, a business James would later establish in California, making his dairy the first on the coast. A photo of a daguerreotype found in the family's possession shows white-painted, symmetrically placed windows and a classically balanced facade, all aspects of traditional New England architecture. Architecture James viewed as ideal for a gentleman farmer. James, the restless adventurer, did not spend much time in Ohio before joining the Army, participating in the Florida Seminole War, the expedition to the Rocky Mountains, and took place in the Mexican War, creating an interest in Mexico which would be long-lasting. In 1849, the cry of gold and opportunity in California's imminent statehood called out to Johnston, so he, later followed by his brothers Thomas, John, and William, along with thousands of others, headed to San Francisco. In 1849, the state of California grew from a population in the tens of thousands to nearly 400,000 by 1860. San Francisco alone saw the number of its inhabitants increase from 400 people in 1849 to over 30,000 people in the end of 1850, the largest migration in U.S. history. In a little over a decade, the population of California drastically changed. In 1846, there were about 7,000 Hispanics and about 1,300 foreigners in California. By 1850, there were 92,000 non-Indians, and the state as a whole had a population of 250,000. This dynamic moment in history would forever change the cultural and physical landscape of California. This population influx worked to the advantage of James, where San Francisco was booming with construction and land acquisition. James' success in the mines allowed him to invest gains in real estate, becoming part owner of the famous El Dorado Saloon in San Francisco, as well as a land speculator. Johnston continued his entrepreneurship by purchasing land throughout the peninsula. He was also a part of the company that bought up claims of Spanish Californians against the United States government. These activities were not only lucrative, but were a means of becoming acquainted with old Spanish families. His skills in Spanish, as well as his assistance to Mexican residents in protecting their property rights, would eventually lead to his meeting Petra Maria de Jara. Petra and James married on April 10, 1852, on the west side of San Francisco's Portsmouth Plaza. This union was a bridge of cultures and traditions between Californios and the new California residents occurring throughout California during this time, brought from the Western migration. With agriculture still a dominant theme in American life in the 1850s, it is not surprising that Johnston looked for a way to invest his money in an area suited to ranching activities. His vision of bringing eastern dairy cattle to California and establishing a New England-style dairy farm, similar to his arrangement in Gallipolis, must have been a top priority as he searched for land along the California coast. He was among the very first Anglos to visit San Benito, nicknamed Spanish Town, which would finally become Half Moon Bay. Here he found the terrain necessary to make his dream come true in a place possessed with Petra's language and culture. He began negotiations with Candelaria Miramontes to acquire 1,162 acres of the Rancho de San Benito. Johnston dispatched his brother Thomas, also a resident of California, to return to Gallipolis to gather 800 head of cattle. With two other brothers, John and William, he was to bring the cattle overland to San Benito. That made for a spectacularly difficult undertaking, leading cattle across the country on an epic drive across plains, deserts, and mountains to be delivered to the first dairy ranch in California. Rancho San Benito was very much still wilderness during this time, and a large proportion of the calves born during the first season are said to have been killed by grizzly bears. Still, Johnston Farm made a large contribution to the dairy industry of San Mateo County. Cattle wasn't the only thing that Johnston would take from Ohio. The colonial farmhouse style Johnston wanted for his ranch in San Benito would have to adapt to the California landscape. Built in a conservative salt box style, the Johnston house stood out among the adobe houses that made up most of San Benito. The rectangular shape with symmetrical pitched roof, a trademark of a salt box house, was not at all traditional in California. With the mild California climate, a small brick chimney and marble fireplace on each floor rather than the traditional central fireplace for warmth was more appropriate. The home is framed of California redwood, thought to have been brought to Half Moon Bay by water, thrown overboard, and floated to shore. The type of construction is similar to what is found in Pennsylvania and Ohio. The Johnston house's use of mortise and tenon, post and beam construction descended with only slight modification from the medieval timber frame building techniques found in 17th century English and colonial houses, making it very unique for California. The style of Johnston House not only gives us insight into James' background, but the architecture and interior symbolizes a home made up of the meeting of cultures and traditions common in California during this time. It was home to a Protestant born in Melrose, Scotland, brought up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Gallipolis, Ohio, his wife born in Mexican California, their children, and Petra's Catholic mother, Ursula, who worshipped at an altar in her own small chapel in the house, and one or more Chinese serving the household. The Johnston House was a great gathering place for the community and rest area for travelers. The good years in the house seem to have been from 1855 to 1859, when tragedy struck with the death of Alice Maria Teresa de Jesus, Johnston's only daughter, at the age of 4. Petra died shortly thereafter due to complications from a previous childbirth, passing at the age of 30 in April of 1861. Johnston's sister Isabel came to assist Petra's mother, Ursula, in raising the children. Johnston, devastated, moved to San Francisco, returning home very rarely. A delayed victim of the financial blow of the Panic of 1873, caused by the rapid expansion of agriculture in the West, Johnston's affairs took a bitter turn in 1877. The San Francisco Savings Union foreclosed on the mortgage for the initial acreage of the ranch after Johnston was unable to make payments. His sons, claiming interest in the property as heirs of Petra's, were able to settle with the bank for 15 lots, including the house, but the rest of the ranch was auctioned off. Less than a year later, James Johnston, one of the pioneers of San Francisco, had died in his room at the Commercial Hotel. Johnston, his son Thomas Francis, his sister Isabella, and his 3 brothers are buried in the Oddfellows Cemetery in Half Moon Bay. However, Petra is in a separate Catholic cemetery. After Johnston's death, James' sister Isabel stayed at the house with the family for 19 years, helping with raising the children. But it is still uncertain how long the Johnston family continued to live there. After the house lost its inhabitants without upkeep, the structure began to decline. Malcolm Watkins, chair of the Department of Cultural History at the Smithsonian Institution, and his wife Joan first saw the derelict Johnston House in June 1962 while driving down the California coast on their honeymoon. They started the effort to restore the house and were actively involved in the project until their deaths. They wrote an interpretive plan for the project that detailed how the restoration should be done and contributed many of the artifacts now in the house. In 1865, the Smithsonian Institution granted us funds to analyze and record the house and its history. After some efforts at restoration, the house became a city, county, and state bicentennial project. The house is built of 90% of original timber. While building the foundation during the initial process of reconstruction, Heavy rains fell, accompanied by wind reaching 70 miles an hour. The violent wind lifted the whole structure off its foundation and crashed it into the ground. What was left resembled timber. Hope was not all lost. George Watson, an outstanding expert in historical restoration, came in to identify the scrambled timber. Shoemaker, builder Dean Pratt, along with his partner and crew, and architect George Rossi, raised the frame. Additional funds were forthcoming and the construction continued. Eventually, plywood went on walls were insulated, and electricity was wired in. And in 1992, a water supply was added. The resurrection of the house was completed in 1994 to be used to illuminate life on the coast side in the 1800s. Those involved with the Johnston house have worked tirelessly to create an authentic view of what once was, showing what the James Johnston house means to Half Moon Bay in California history.